The morning Clarence Duvall finished digging that well, a Tuesday in late April of 1961, the first thing he did was lower a tin bucket on a rope and pull it back up full of water so cold it made his wrist ache where the rope had pressed. He stood at the edge of the hole in the low corner of his south pasture, 42 feet of hand-dug earth behind him and 11 days of work in his shoulders and back, and he drank from that bucket the way a man drinks when he has been right about something for a long time and the ground has finally confirmed it. Nobody came to see. Nobody drove slow on County Road 12 to watch. Nobody stopped. That was fine by Clarence. He had not dug the well for an audience. He was 56 years old, a lean man from Grundy County, Iowa, with hands that looked like they had been made from the same dark walnut as the barn door handles, hard and fitted in belonging to whatever they held. He wore the same khaki work pants he wore every day, a flannel shirt the color of a hayfield in August, and boots that had been resoled twice and were working on a third life. He had never owned a pair of dress shoes. He had been to 4 funerals in work boots and figured the people being buried had known him well enough not to mind. His farm was 200 acres in the north end of Hardin County, Iowa, flat land that ran from County Road 12 on the south to the Boone River drainage on the north, black topsoil over clay over limestone, the kind of land that rewarded patience and punished impatience in roughly equal measure over time. He had farmed it since 1948 when he had bought it from the estate of a man named Gerhardt who had farmed it before him and whose widow had wanted a fast sale and a fair price, and Clarence had provided both, paying cash from savings he had accumulated in 11 years of working other men's land and living on very little. He had learned to farm from his father, Edmund Duvall, who had come to Iowa from Tennessee in 1907 with $31 and a willingness to work that people who had grown up comfortable sometimes mistook for stubbornness. Edmund had bought his first 40 acres in 1914 with cash saved in a coffee tin under a loose floorboard, and he had written in the journal he kept every winter that the best thing about paying cash was that the bank could not call you in the middle of the night to tell you the terms had changed. Edmund's journal was the most important document Clarence owned. He kept it wrapped in oilcloth on the shelf above the workbench in the machine shed, between a spare carburetor for the Farmall M and a coffee can of assorted bolts that had accumulated over 30 years of fixing things other men would have thrown away. He had read it so many times that certain pages had gone soft at the edges, the pencil lines fading into the paper as if being slowly absorbed back into the earth Edmund had written about. The entry that had led to the well was from August of 1936, the worst summer of the Dust Bowl. Edmund had written about it in careful detail across 6 pages, his hand getting shakier as the weeks went on. He wrote about the neighbors whose deep bored wells had gone dry one by one. He wrote about the neighbors who had borrowed money to install new pumping systems that also went dry. And then he wrote, in a sentence Clarence had memorized without trying to, the Hendersons 2 miles east still have water from the hand-dug well Herman's father put in 1899. 41 feet deep, hits a seasonal seep off the limestone shelf. Not much water. But more than enough. Clarence had been thinking about that sentence since 1959, when a young man from the county extension office named Porter Whitfield had driven out to County Road 12 in a truck that still had the dealer sticker in the window and unrolled a poster on Clarence's kitchen table showing a diagram of the Ogallala Aquifer in red and blue cross-section. Porter Whitfield had a degree from Iowa State and spoke in the smooth, confident voice of a man who had never watched a crop fail. The technology now exists, Whitfield had said, to tap into this resource at depths of 200 feet or more. A center pivot system can irrigate up to 500 acres. Yields on corn can be increased 30 to 40% in the first season. Clarence had listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said, "How old is that water?" Whitfield blinked. "Pardon?" "The water in that aquifer. How long has it been down there?" "Geologically speaking, it accumulated over tens of thousands of years. The recharge rate is quite slow." "So it is like money your grandfather saved," Clarence said. "You can spend it. You just cannot put it back." Whitfield smiled the way educated young men sometimes smiled at older men who said true but inconvenient things. "That is one way to look at it," he said. "Another way is that the farms that use this technology will outcompete the farms that do not." Clarence thanked him for coming and walked into the truck and stood in the driveway watching the truck go down County Road 12 trailing a small plume of dust. Then he went back inside and sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and looked at the poster Whitfield had forgotten to take with him, and he thought about the Hendersons and their 41-foot well and he made a decision. He spent 2 full years watching the low corner of his south pasture before he put a shovel in it. He watched the crabgrass stay green 3 weeks longer than anywhere else on the property after a dry spell. He watched an anthill near the old fence post rise higher than any anthill had any reason to rise in flat country. He watched the frost in early March leave that corner clear 2 days before the surrounding ground thawed. These were the signs Edmund had described in a winter entry from 1923, the signs that told a man paying attention that water was close under him and moving. On the Monday morning he started digging, Norma Duvall was at the kitchen sink washing the breakfast dishes. She was a quiet woman from Tama County who had grown up in a house where silence was not uncomfortable and people thought before they spoke and sometimes decided not to speak at all. Clarence had told her the Sunday before what he planned to do, and she had asked 2 questions. How long will it take? 10 days, maybe 12. And what if you do not hit water? I will fill it back in. She had dried her hands on the dish towel, folded it over the oven handle the way she always did, and said, all right then. I will bring lunch out at noon. She brought lunch out at noon every day for 11 days, leaving a mason jar of water on the fence post nearest the dig site without being asked. Clarence had always thought that one of the best things about Norma was that she never confused asking a question with making an objection. On the 11th day he hit water at 42 feet, cold and clear with a faint smell of limestone, and he climbed out and stood in the April sun feeling it on his back and then went inside and told Norma, who was writing a letter to her sister in Marshalltown. Got water, he said. She looked up from the letter. Good, she said, and went back to writing. The morning after he finished the well, Clarence drove into Eldora to pick up a bag of bone meal from Kessler's Feed and Supply on Route 30. Kessler's was a high-ceiling building that smelled of grain dust and motor oil, and there were always 4 or 5 men at the counter on weekday mornings, leaning and perching and drinking coffee from paper cups and talking about whatever local news was circulating that week. That morning the news was Clarence Duvall's well. He heard it before he reached the counter. He had his back to the room, reading the label on a bag of blood meal, when he heard the voice of Boyd Whitaker, who farmed 600 acres north of town and had recently signed a contract with a company called AgriPrime Systems for a center pivot installation that was going to cost, by Boyd's own public accounting at the grain co-op 3 weeks earlier, $114,000 over 20 years of payments. Hand dug it, Boyd was saying. Like Abraham Lincoln. Like it is 1850. There was laughter. Not mean laughter exactly, but the kind that happens in groups when someone says something that makes the group feel positioned above it. How deep? Someone asked. 40-some feet. Going to irrigate corn with a 40-foot hand-dug well. Boyd's voice carried the comfortable contempt of a man certain the room is with him. I told my son about it and he said, Dad, that is not a well, that is a hole. He is not wrong. More laughter. Clarence set down the blood meal, picked up the bone meal he had come for, and walked to the counter. Tom Kessler, who had known Clarence for 30 years and was a decent man, gave him a careful look and said, Morning, Clarence. Boyd Whitaker had turned. He was big and red-faced, with the particular ease of a man who had borrowed a great deal of money and had not yet had to worry about paying it back. Clarence, he said, with a grin that had too much friendliness on the surface. Heard you finished your well. How much you figure you can irrigate with 40 feet of hand-dug? Enough for what I am doing, Clarence said. What are you doing? 40 acres? Boyd looked around the room to confirm his audience, which he had. My pivot covers 500 acres with 1 motor. That is a different category of farming, Clarence. That is the 20th century. Clarence put his money on the counter. He was quiet for a moment, and several men near the counter leaned in slightly without meaning to. The 20th century has been here 60 years, Clarence said. I have noticed it makes some people richer and some people poorer. The difference seems to be whether they own what they bought. He took his bone meal and nodded to Tom Kessler and walked out. Behind him Boyd said, he will be singing a different tune in 5 years when his yields are half mine. Nobody agreed out loud. But nobody disagreed, which was what Boyd chose to hear as agreement. What Clarence did not hear, because he was already loading the bone meal into the truck, was old Felix Brower near the back saying quietly to nobody in particular, Man does not owe $1 to anyone though. That is something. The mockery at Kessler's was not the worst of it. It was the start of a pattern that would define the next decade of Clarence Duvall's life in Hardin County, a pattern of exclusion that went beyond neighbors laughing at a hand-dug well and into something more systematic and more deliberate. In the fall of 1961, the Hardin County Farm Bureau formed what it called a Modernization Committee, a group of a dozen farmers tasked with identifying countywide improvements in agricultural technology and advocating for them with the State Extension Office. Clarence had been a Farm Bureau member for 15 years and had attended every annual meeting without exception. He was not invited to join the committee. When he asked Tom Kessler, who was on the committee, why not, Tom looked uncomfortable and said that the committee was focused on irrigation technology and chemical inputs and that the committee felt his approach was not aligned with those priorities. Clarence nodded and said thank you and drove home. The following spring, the Farm Bureau organized a county-wide program that arranged group discount pricing on fertilizer inputs and irrigation equipment through partnerships with AgriPrime and 2 chemical suppliers. The program was open to all Farm Bureau members. When Clarence applied, the committee told him the program required participants to commit to a minimum acreage under center pivot irrigation, a threshold he could not meet with a hand-dug well. The threshold had not been listed in the original announcement. When Clarence pointed this out in writing to the County Farm Bureau director, a man named Leonard Pruitt replied that the threshold was a reasonable operational requirement and had always been implicit in the program design. Clarence kept a copy of the letter in a folder in the desk drawer. He did not respond to it. The third incident was the most direct. In the summer of 1962, the Hardin County National Bank launched what it called a Farm Futures Program, offering favorable loan terms to farmers investing in modern irrigation infrastructure. The program was advertised in the Hardin County Times and at the co-op. Clarence did not plan to apply because he did not plan to borrow money, but his neighbor to the east, a quiet man named Art Belden who farmed 120 acres and was genuinely interested in a small supplemental system, told Clarence that when he had gone to the bank to inquire, the loan officer, a man named Franklin Kress, had said something that stopped Art cold. "We are looking for progressive operators," Franklin Kress had told Art. "Men who are modernizing their approach. If you are taking advice from Duvall over on County Road 12, you might want to reconsider who your models are. That man is going backward. We are not in the business of financing backward." Art Belden told Clarence about this on a Saturday morning over the fence between their properties, uncomfortable in the way a man is uncomfortable when he has to repeat something unkind about someone he respects. Clarence listened to the whole thing without changing his expression and then said, "Did you get your loan?" "I got it," Art said. "But he made me feel like I had to apologize for knowing you." Clarence looked at the fence wire for a moment. Then he said, "You did not have to apologize for anything." He went back to his machine shed and spent the rest of the morning rebuilding a carburetor, and he did not say anything to anyone about Franklin Kress or the Farm Futures Program, not because it did not bother him, but because what bothered him and what was useful to say about it were two different things, and Clarence had learned early that the gap between those two categories was where most people wasted most of their time. He did, however, write in his own notebook that evening, a composition book he had started keeping alongside Edmund's journal, "The bank does not finance backward. It finances debt. Those are not the same direction." His yields in 1961 were 78 bushels per acre on corn. Boyd Whitaker and the other irrigators came in at 112 to 119. The comparison was made at the co-op in October with the quiet arithmetic of scale tickets. Clarence loaded his grain and drove home and paid his property tax in November with money he had in the bank, and the bank received his payment without comment about his methods. What sustained him during those years was not indifference to the dismissal. He was not indifferent to it. He was a man who felt things at normal human depth. He simply did not perform his feelings for people who had not earned the right to see them. What sustained him was the work itself in Norma and, on winter evenings, Edmund's journal. He had a son, Raymond, who was 19 in 1961 and finishing his first year at Iowa State studying agricultural engineering. Raymond was a serious young man with his mother's patience and his grandfather's level eyes. He came home on weekends and helped with planning and asked questions that showed he was paying attention, and Clarence thought that was a good sign, not just that Raymond asked questions but that he asked the right ones. Raymond came home that May weekend and found Clarence in the machine shed rebuilding the carburetor of the Farmall M, a 1952 tractor that was, by any objective measure, past the age at which most men would have traded it for something newer. Raymond sat on the workbench and watched for a while and then said, "I heard Boyd Whitaker called your well a hole." "A hole is what it is before you finish it," Clarence said. "After you finish it, it is a well." Raymond was quiet a moment. Then, carefully, he said, "It does seem like a lot of work for not much water." Clarence set down the carburetor and looked at his son. "You remember what your grandfather wrote about the summer of '36? What happened to the Hendersons? The hand-dug well. 41 feet. Every deep-bored well in the county went dry. The Hendersons had water all summer." He picked the carburetor back up. "I am not digging a well to compete with Boyd Whitaker. I am digging it so that when Boyd Whitaker's pump breaks down in July, I still have corn." Raymond considered this. Iowa State would say the productivity gains justify the risk. "Iowa State does not have to make the payments," Clarence said. They were quiet for a while after that, which was comfortable between them. Raymond graduated in 1964 and took a job with a consulting firm in Des Moines and married a woman named Carol from Polk County in 1966. He came home on holidays and long weekends, driving a newer truck now, his own, paid from the consulting salary. Carol was polite and careful and regarded the Duvall farm with the measured interest of someone visiting a place they have heard about but cannot quite situate in the present tense. She called Clarence Mr. Duvall for 3 years until he asked her to stop. By the summer of 1963, there were 3 new center pivot systems visible from County Road 12 on the north end of Hardin County. They were impressive in the way that large expensive things are impressive, long arms of pipe rolling on wheeled towers across the fields in a slow continuous circle, leaving perfect discs of dark wet soil that from the air looked like green coins pressed into the landscape. The farm magazines were full of them. The Farm Bureau newsletters were full of them. Clarence drove past the new pivots on his way to town and back and did not comment on them to anyone. He continued farming 200 acres with a hand-dug well and the farm all-in and a set of practices he had inherited from his father and refined over 15 years of paying close attention to his specific ground. He had also, in the winter of 1962, made the most useful thing he would ever create, a composition book in which he systematically transcribed every observation Edmund had made in the original journal about the hydrology of the farm, organized by field and by season. Not the philosophy, not the family history, but the data. Edmund had not called it data. He had written it as description, as accumulated noticing. But it was data, Clarence recognized, as reliable in its way as anything in a laboratory, because it was specific and local and had been gathered over 4 decades by someone with no reason to make it say anything except what it actually said. From Edmund's records and his own observations, Clarence understood the water behavior on his property with a precision that no soil survey had matched. He knew which fields held moisture longest after rain. He knew which slopes fed which drainages. He knew, from Edmund's 1936 entries, that the northwest corner of the home 40 was the last to go dry in drought because it sat downslope from a limestone shelf at approximately 30 feet, a shelf that held a perched water table above it, a seasonal reservoir that refilled with every significant rain and drained slowly through the surrounding clay. That was what his well drew from. Not the Ogallala. The shallow seasonal water that fell from the sky and filtered down and rested on the limestone, the same water that kept the crabgrass green in that low corner 3 weeks longer than anywhere else, the water that told him where to dig if he had learned to read what the land was saying. He was not against technology. He had a tractor, an electric milking machine, a radio in the kitchen. He was against debt that exceeded what it purchased, and he was against dependence on systems he could not understand and repair himself. The farm all-in he could disassemble and rebuild in the machine shed with hand tools. An Agri-Prime center pivot hydraulic failure required a technician from Des Moines at whatever price the technician named, because you were not in a position to negotiate. In 1968 he bought a rebuilt farm all-H from a seller who had written it off as scrap, paying $430 for a 1948 machine that he put back into working condition with 3 weekends in the shed and $60 in parts. It had no cab, no hydraulics, no electronics of any kind. The throttle was a hand lever on the steering column. The choke was a pull knob. It ran on diesel and the particular mechanical stubbornness of old iron, which Clarence considered its most reliable feature. He called it the H-knot affection. Identification. The late 1960s and early 1970s moved through Iowa on a tide of rising commodity prices and readily available credit. Banks courted farm customers with long-term loan packages, operating on the philosophy that land values would rise indefinitely and farmland equity was essentially unlimited collateral. This philosophy was entirely true until it suddenly was not, which is how most financial philosophies of that kind work. In 1971, the Hardin County Farm Bureau held its annual meeting at the Eldora High School gymnasium, and the guest speaker was Garrett Soleil from the State Extension Office, a careful-looking man of about 40 with a neat part in his hair who had given this talk many times and had never been seriously challenged during it. He talked for an hour about modernization returns and productivity curves and the competitive necessity of capital investment in irrigation technology. Toward the end of the talk, gesturing at a chart showing yield comparisons between irrigated and non-irrigated operations in the county, Soleil said, "There are still farms in this county operating on what I would call a pre-scientific philosophy, a relic approach that made sense in an earlier era but that simply cannot compete in the agricultural economy of the 1970s. He said it without looking directly at Clarence, who was in the back row, which was the kind of pointed comment that maintains plausible deniability about its target. Several people in the room looked at Clarence and then looked away. Clarence waited until the talk was done. Then he raised his hand and was called on and said, "You said the productivity gains from deep well irrigation justify the capital investment over a 20-year horizon. What is your assumption on the recharge rate of the Ogallala in this county?" Soleil blinked. "The recharge rate? Per year?" How much water returns for every foot drawn out? That is somewhat variable. The aquifer is a vast resource, and in a 20-year investment horizon, depletion is not a significant concern. The natural recharge rate in most of Hardin County is less than half an inch per year, Clarence said. The wells here are drawing 4 to 6 feet per year on average. That is 1 inch in for every 12 out. Over 20 years, that is not a resource. It is a drawdown. What happens to the productivity gains in year 21 when the water table has dropped 40 feet? The room was quiet. Soleil said, "Those are long-term projections involving significant uncertainty." "So does the 20-year return calculation," Clarence said. He gathered his coat and walked out into the November night, and when Norma asked how the meeting was, he said, "Fine. Same as always." She looked at him over her reading glasses. "Did you say something that needed saying?" "Yes." "Good," she said, and went back to her book. The thing about being called a relic in a public room full of your neighbors is that it does not stay in that room. It travels the way county news travels, through the feed store and the co-op and the church parking lot and the lunch counter at Merle's Diner in Eldora, and it accumulates a kind of social sediment that shapes how people treat you in small daily ways. Clarence noticed that fewer farmers stopped to talk at the co-op. He noticed that he was not mentioned in the Farm Bureau newsletter's annual feature on county operations. He noticed that when the Extension Office organized a farm tour for visiting agricultural students from Iowa State in the spring of 1972, 9 farms were included on the tour route, and his was not among them despite being one of the longest continuously operated family farms in the county. He went to see Leonard Pruitt, still the Farm Bureau director, and asked directly why his farm had been excluded from the tour. Pruitt was a man who was not comfortable with direct questions. He adjusted papers on his desk and said that the tour was designed to showcase modern practices and that the selection committee felt the Duvall operation did not represent the direction the county extension program was promoting. "Does the county extension program represent all farmers in the county or only the ones using methods it approves of?" Clarence asked. Pruitt said that was not a fair characterization. Clarence said that he thought it was a precise characterization and that he would appreciate being included in future programs. He said it without raising his voice and without any visible emotion, which seemed to make Pruitt more uncomfortable than anger would have. He was not included in subsequent programs. He stopped asking. What he did instead, in the winter of 1972, was begin visiting Edmund's journal with a new question. Edmund had faced his own version of this, Clarence knew. He had been the man in Tennessee who did not expand when everyone else expanded, the man in Iowa who paid cash when everyone else borrowed, the man in 1934 who had water when no one else did. What had Edmund done with the social pressure of those years? He found the answer in a December entry from 1929, written 3 months after the stock market crash that had not yet reached the farms but was beginning to be felt at the banks. Edmund had written, "People ask me why I do not join the movement toward expansion. I tell them I have my reasons. They do not believe me. That is fine. The land does not care whether they believe me. The land only cares whether I am right." Clarence read that entry 3 times and then closed the journal and went to bed. By 1979, the answer to the question of what happened when the chain failed was beginning to appear in Iowa farm country in ways the journals and the Extension Office newsletters were still describing as temporary. Interest rates had been climbing since 1977 and the loans that had seemed manageable at 7% were being refinanced at 13, 14, 15%. Land values that had been the collateral foundation for a decade of expansion lending began to plateau in 1980 and, in some areas, to fall. Clarence noticed that Boyd Whitaker was driving an older truck in the autumn of 1980. He noticed that the Agri-Prime service vehicle, regular as a season on the county roads in summer, now sometimes had a for sale notice in the rear window. He noticed that Franklin Kress, the loan officer who had told Art Belden that Clarence was going backward, had left the Hardin County National Bank for a position in Ames, which was often what happened when a bank's lending book began to look different from what had been expected. He said nothing about any of this. He continued doing what he was doing. The summer of 1983 came to Iowa with the particular brutality of drought years, not gradually but suddenly, a shift from adequate spring rains to a July that ran 10 degrees above the 30-year average for 3 weeks and then continued. The corn was in its critical pollination period, those 2 weeks when every plant is making the biological decision about how many kernels it will fill, and what it decides in conditions of heat and water stress is always the same, fewer. The center pivot motors ran 18 hours a day. Boyd Whitaker's operation, the Schaefer Farm, 3 other irrigated operations within sight of County Road 12, all of them pulling hard from deep wells that had been running continuously for 22 years. And the water table, dropping 6 to 8 inches per year on average and now being drawn on faster than it had ever been drawn on before, showed in the third week of July what Clarence had understood would eventually show. Boyd Whitaker's north well dropped below the pump intake on July 19. The pump ran dry, cavitated, and blew a motor seal before the pressure sensors cut it off. The repair would take 8 days and $3,000. 160 acres of corn entered the critical pollination period without water. Earl Schaefer's main well dropped to 60% of its rated flow. His pivots could not cover their assigned acreage. He shut down the outer third of each pivot's arc to concentrate water on the inner portions, leaving a ring of dying corn at the perimeter of each of his 3 fields, visible from County Road 12 as a band of brown in the otherwise green and dying patchwork of the drought. Clarence's hand-dug well, 42 feet into the perch table above the limestone shelf, ran at approximately the same flow rate it had run at since April of 1961. The seasonal aquifer it drew from had been recharged by the spring rains, and the limestone shelf held the water the way it always had. Clarence irrigated his corn by running water down carefully leveled furrows for 12 hours at a time on a 4-day rotation, a method that was inefficient by any modern measure and effective by the only measure that mattered in late July, which was whether the corn had water when it needed it. His corn pollinated in the heat. The yields would not be exceptional. But the corn pollinated. Boyd Whitaker's north 160 acres pollinated without water. The yield reduction in corn without water during pollination runs between 40 and 80% depending on severity and duration. Boyd knew this with the precise and terrible knowledge of a man who has studied the subject in theory and is now experiencing it as fact on land he owns and owes money on. On a Thursday evening in the last week of July, a pickup turned into the Duvall driveway and stopped at the machine shed. Clarence was inside sharpening disc blades. He came out to see who it was. Boyd Whitaker got out slowly, the way men get out of trucks when they are carrying something heavy that is not a physical weight. He was 53 and he looked older. He wore a clean shirt, which Clarence noticed because Boyd always wore clean shirts, and he thought it said something about a man that he maintained that standard even on the worst days. "Clarence," Boyd said. He did not move toward the shed. "Boyd." There was a silence. Behind them the H sat in the corner of the shed, its red paint oxidized to the color of old brick, ticking as the metal cooled from the day. A meadowlark called from the south pasture and went quiet. "My north well went down," Boyd said. His voice was level in the way that voices go level when there is great pressure behind them and the person has decided to hold it by will alone. "North pivot is down. 160 acres without water during pollination." He paused. "I have 2 more payment cycles on the AgriPrime contract before I can refinance at a better rate. The payment is $3,800 a month." He looked at the ground. "I came to ask if you would consider letting me run a gravity line from your well to the southeast corner of my north field. I would pay for the pipe and compensate you for whatever water use you think is fair." Clarence looked at him. "How far is it from my well to your southeast corner?" Boyd had measured. "About 410 yards. Clarence was quiet for a while. The meadowlark called again. 400 yards of 4-inch pipe with a 2-foot drop over the distance would give you maybe 3 gallons a minute. Not enough for a pivot. I know that. I would run it down the furrows on the southeast quadrant. Gravity fed. Old way, cover maybe 30 acres. Clarence nodded slowly. "I do not want your money. My well makes what I need and cannot make more than that anyway. You run your pipe." Boyd was quiet a long moment. "I said some things at Kessler's," he said. "Back in '61. And other times. I remember. I was wrong to say them." Clarence looked at him steadily, not with satisfaction, not with the pleasure of vindication, but with the directness of a man who is deciding what is true and what needs to be said about it. "You said what made sense to you at the time. You believed in what you were buying. That is not wrong. What went wrong came later." Boyd put his hand out. Clarence shook it. They stood in the driveway for a moment in the quiet of 2 men who have said enough. The pipe was laid the following day. 3 gallons of minute fed by gravity for 12 hours a day was not much, but it saved 30 acres of Boyd's corn through the critical 2 weeks and preserved a portion of what would otherwise have been a total loss. It did not save Boyd's operation. The damage to the other 130 acres was too severe, and the yield that fall combined with the commodity prices of 1983, which were dismal, and the interest rate on the AgriPrime loan, refinanced at 17% in 1981, added to a number that the bank found insufficient. Boyd sold 300 of his 600 acres in the fall of 1983 to meet his obligations. Earl Schaefer lost his entire operation in December. The bank held the paper on 1,500 acres and sold them in parcels through the spring of 1984. 40 acres on the east side of the Schaefer property went to Clarence Duvall, who bought at auction for $480 per acre, approximately 40% of its 1979 peak, paying cash from savings. He now farmed 240 acres. He had not planned to farm 240. But Edmund's journal was clear on the subject of once-in-a-generation opportunities. Do not let them pass because you were waiting for a better time. The better time is when the price is right and you have the cash. Raymond had come home for the weekend and was at the kitchen table with Clarence the evening before the auction. He looked at the sale notice and said, $480 an acre. That is a strong price for distressed land. The east half has drainage problems, Clarence said. The west 20 is the best ground in that section. How do you know? I have been watching it for 12 years, Clarence said. The grass on the west 20 is consistently stronger than the east because of a subsurface drainage pattern that feeds it. Nobody without local knowledge would see it. The auction price reflects the east half's reputation. The west 20 is what I am buying. Raymond looked at his father. He had the expression of a man reassessing a framework he had been using for some time. Have you always known about the west 20? Since 1971, Clarence said. I wrote it in the notebook. That was also the summer that Clarence was asked to do something he had not been asked to do before. The problem that asked it of him was not his corn and not his well but an 18-ton county road grader that had no business being where it was. The county road maintenance crew had been using a section of low ground adjacent to Clarence's south pasture as a staging area for road repair equipment. The low ground had been wet through most of June following adequate spring rains, and when the county's champion road grader was moved from the staging area on a Wednesday morning in July, it did not make it to the road. It made it 40 feet before the saturated soil gave way under the front axle and the machine went in 18 inches on the right front, tilting enough that the left rear also settled, and within 2 hours the undercarriage was in contact with the soil and the wheels were bearing no functional load. The county road supervisor, Gerald Hoft, brought in a commercial tow truck that afternoon. The operator set his anchor on a telephone pole across the road and began pulling. The tow truck's rear axle lifted because the angle was wrong, the cable working against the machine's geometry rather than with it, and after 20 minutes of work that moved the grader 4 inches, Gerald told the operator to stop before something failed. The following day Gerald brought the county's 4-wheel drive farm tractor, 70 horsepower, rubber tires. The operator connected a chain to the grader's front drawbar and pulled. The rubber tires spun on the wet approach and produced impressive noise in mud and zero forward movement. The approach was cordoned off and Gerald Hof stood in the July heat and looked at an 18-ton machine that could not be moved by a 20-ton winch truck or a 70-horsepower tractor. By the following Monday it was local news. The Hardin County Times sent a photographer. The commercial recovery firm from Des Moines quoted $8,000 and a 4 to 5 day wait. Clarence drove past the site on Saturday morning on his way to pick up a part in Eldora and slowed down without stopping. He looked at the stuck grader from the truck window with the glass down, taking in the angle of the machine, the geometry of its lean, the character of the soil around it, where the dry ground began relative to the nearest solid anchor points. He drove to Eldora and got his part and drove home and spent the rest of Saturday in the machine shed. On Sunday morning he drove to the site with the Farmall H on a flatbed trailer behind the pickup. Gerald Hof was there because Gerald had been at the site most of the past week and now felt a proprietary connection to it. He looked at the old red tractor on the trailer with the expression of a man who is too tired to be openly skeptical but who is making an effort. "Morning, Clarence," he said. "Morning, Gerald. I would like to try something if you are not expecting the Des Moines people before Thursday." Gerald looked at the H. "What are you planning to do with that?" "Move your grader," Clarence said. Gerald Hof was not a man who wasted energy on skepticism when skepticism cost him nothing but a few hours and he had nothing else working. "All right," he said. "What do you need?" Clarence needed the tow truck moved, the chain cleared from the grader's front, and access to the mature cottonwood tree 60 feet from the grader's right front corner. He also needed 2 8-foot sections of 2 by 12 oak plank he had brought on the trailer, and a block and tackle rig assembled from salvaged components he had collected over 30 years, 3 double-shift pulleys from an old hay loader and a collection of clevis pins and heavy shackles. He spent 45 minutes setting up. Boyd Whitaker had heard about it at the co-op and driven by in the way that people drive past scenes they are curious about while pretending they happen to be going in that direction. He stood near his truck with his arms folded, watching. What Clarence was constructing was not complicated in principle. The block and tackle anchored to the cottonwood and rigged to the grader's right front axle housing would multiply the H's pulling force by approximately 4, generating an effective pull of between 40 and 50,000 pounds. But the direction was the critical element. The tow truck and the county tractor had both pulled from the front, directly in line with the grader's length. This was the intuitive direction and also the wrong one. Pulling a stuck machine directly from the front attempts to drag it through the resistance of the soil along its full length and full weight, requiring force proportional to the weight, the depth of embedment, and the cohesion of saturated clay. Those numbers were not in anyone's favor. What Clarence was doing was rigging the pull at approximately 25 degrees off the right front corner, toward the cottonwood, while placing the oak planks under the left front wheel and the right rear wheel to create rolling surfaces. The geometry shifted the problem from extraction, drag the whole machine against all that resistance, to rotation, pivot the machine on its embedded axle while lifting the embedded corner, a task requiring far less force because it worked with the machine's weight distribution rather than against it. He had learned the principle from Edmund's journal, specifically a winter entry from 1941 describing how Edmund had freed a stuck hay wagon from a creek crossing using a fence post as a lever and a chain draped over a sapling. Different scale. Same geometry. He checked the rigging twice, not because he doubted himself but because the difference between a man who is careful and a man who is lucky is that the careful man checks. He climbed onto the H. The engine turned over on the third pull of the starter rope, coughed once, and settled into the uneven idle of old iron, honest about its condition. He let it warm 2 minutes, eased it into first gear, and took up the slack in the cable until the block and tackle was taut and the cottonwood was beginning to creak. He did not accelerate. He held steady at 1200 RPM in first gear, which produced through the transmission in the 4-to-1 mechanical advantage a pulling force applied to the grader's right front corner not in a jerk or a surge but in a steady patient tension, the kind that does not announce itself but simply continues until something gives. The grader moved. Not explosively. Not dramatically. It began to rotate, slowly, the right front corner coming up out of the clay as the left front rolled on its plank and the right rear followed on its plank, the whole machine pivoting around the geometry Clarence had arranged, moving not through the resistance but around it. From when the cable went taut to when all 4 wheels of the grader were on solid ground, 11 minutes. Clarence idled back the H and climbed down and began uncoupling the block and tackle from the cottonwood. Gerald Hoft walked to the grader and put his hand on the front axle and then stood up and looked at Clarence. How did you know that would work? Same principle as moving a stuck wagon out of a creek, Clarence said. Different scale. Same geometry. Boyd Whitaker was still standing near his truck. He was looking at the H, its red paint dull in the morning sun, with the expression of a man who is quietly revising something important. My grandfather had one of those, he said. 48 or 49 model. He sold it for scrap in 65. I paid $430 for this one in 68, Clarence said. Same year Agri Prime charged you $1,100 for a hydraulic service call. Boyd looked at him. There was a pause in which something was understood without being stated. You are not going to let me forget that, are you? Boyd said. It was not quite a question. I already forgot it, Clarence said, coiling the rope. I just remember numbers. The Hardin County Times ran a story with the headline Old Tractor Does What Modern Equipment Could Not, and the story was picked up by the Iowa Farm Bureau newsletter and eventually by an agricultural engineering publication out of Ames. Several people called the farm in the following weeks. 2 were journalists. One was Professor David Mead, chair of the agricultural engineering department at Iowa State, who asked if he could come out and talk to Clarence about the rigging setup. Mead arrived on a Saturday, a careful man in his 50s who had the specific intelligence of someone who knows what he does not know, which Clarence considered more useful than its opposite. They spent 2 hours in the machine shed. Mead walked through the block and tackle system, the angle of pull, the function of the oak planks as rolling surfaces. He took notes on a legal pad and asked questions that were specific and technical and did not assume answers they did not have. When he was done he looked at the H for a long moment. We teach compound mechanical advantage in engineering 201, he said. Archimedes. Levers and pulleys. He paused. Most of our students have never seen it applied in a field context. They know the equations. They do not know what the equations look like when they work. The equations work the same way they always did, Clarence said. The soil does not know you are using a computer. Mead almost smiled. Would you be willing to come talk to my students? Clarence thought about it. I am not a teacher, he said. No, Mead agreed. That is why I am asking. He went to Iowa State in October, the first time he had been on the campus in 30 years. Mead's class had about 60 students in a room with stadium seating, most of them in their early 20s, most of them living in a world of theory and screens and not yet acquainted with the kind of mud that does not respond to equations. Clarence wore his work pants and work boots and flannel shirt, which was the only way he ever appeared anywhere. He stood in front of the room and talked for 50 minutes, not about the stuck grader directly but about the problem of stuck things in general, about finding the path of least resistance in a physical system by understanding its geometry rather than increasing the force applied to it. He drew diagrams on the whiteboard, the drawings of a man who understands what he is drawing without having drawn many drawings, and they were useful for precisely that reason. He talked about Edmund's journal as a data set, not as family history. As 40 years of accumulated physical observation about the behavior of a specific piece of land, observation that was local and specific and gathered over decades by someone with no reason to record anything except what he actually saw. He talked about water, about the difference between a resource that renews and one that depletes, and about the time horizon over which that difference becomes visible, and about the problem of making 20-year financial decisions based on 3 years of data. When Mead asked for questions, there were more than usual, which Mead told Clarence afterward was a reliable sign that something true had been said. A young woman in the second row asked about failure modes in complex systems versus simple ones and how you calculated comparative risk. A young man near the back asked about the economics of paying cash versus financing and where the break-even point was. Another asked how you knew when an observation made a generation ago was still valid. Clarence answered each directly and briefly, without jargon, without academic scaffolding. On the last question he said, "You test it. You watch the same patch of ground the observation was made about, through wet years and dry years, and you compare what the old record predicted with what you actually see. If it is still right after 40 years, it is probably right. If it is wrong, you write that down too. The point of keeping records is not to be correct. It is to know how often you are wrong and about what." A student near the front, without raising his hand, said, "That is just the scientific method." "Yes," Clarence said. "Your grandfather was probably doing it without calling it that." He drove back to Hardin County in the October dark, the harvested fields going gray in the last light, the smell of corn silage coming through the cracked window. He thought about the room of students, the quality of their questions, the way they had leaned forward when he talked about the stuck grader. He thought about what Mead had said, "They know the equations but not what the equations look like when they work." He thought that this was the central problem of how useful knowledge was being passed on, that it was being transmitted in forms disconnected from consequences, that you could learn the equation for mechanical advantage without ever standing beside a machine that would not move and understanding in your body what the equation was actually about. The equation was not wrong. But it did not carry the weight of the field, the specific gravity of something genuinely at stake, and without that weight it remained theoretical in a way that made it, in the critical moment, less reliable than an old journal and 40 years of attention to the same piece of land. He did not think this made him smarter than the students. He thought it made him different from them, in possession of different knowledge, and he thought the problem was not the students but the gap between what they were being taught and what they would eventually need to know, a gap that neither the university nor the farm could close alone. He parked in the driveway and sat for a moment in the truck. The machine shed was dark but he could see the shape of the H through the open door. He went inside. Norma had supper on the table. She looked up when he came in. "How was it?" "Good questions," he said. "Did you answer them?" "Tried to." She put the bread basket on the table and sat down. "Wash your hands," she said. He washed his hands. Raymond called on a Sunday in November, which was unusual because Raymond called on Wednesdays. He called on Sunday because he had seen the Times story and had wanted to call right away but had waited for a day when there was time to say things properly. "I saw the story," he said. "Yes. The force multiplication factor they quoted was slightly off. I noticed." Raymond was quiet a moment. "I teach my clients the principle of mechanical advantage in equipment selection. I have never seen it applied in the field that way." "It is applied in the field all the time," Clarence said, "just not usually with a $45,000 machine involved." Raymond laughed. Then he said, "Carol and I have been talking. About whether we want Helen to grow up in the suburbs." Helen was their daughter, 7 years old. Clarence said nothing, which was his response to information he was still considering. "She asks about the farm every time we talk about where we come from," Raymond said. "She wants to know about the well. She wants to know about the H. What does Carol think?" "Carol thinks suburban schools are better." "They might be." Carol also thinks that Helen is learning things from television that Carol wishes she was learning from somewhere else. Clarence looked out the kitchen window at the machine shed. Would you like to bring her out for a summer? Raymond paused. Would you be willing to have us for a month? Let Helen see what the farm actually is. Come for the whole summer, Clarence said. Stay through harvest if you want. There is work enough. Helen Duvall arrived in June of 1984, a small 7-year-old with her father's patient eyes and an unnerving habit of asking direct questions and then waiting in complete silence for the complete answer. She wore rubber boots that were too large for her and walked behind Clarence in the corn rows in the morning, stepping precisely in his footprints, which were not a convenient size for a 7-year-old but which she attempted nonetheless. On her second morning she asked Clarence why the ground in one part of the pasture was darker than the rest. He stopped walking and looked at the ground and then at her. Where do you see it? She pointed. The low corner. That part. Because it holds moisture longer after rain. The soil stays wet when the rest dries out. Why does it stay wet? Because there is a shelf of limestone under the ground about 30 feet down. Water sits on top of it instead of draining away. How do you know the limestone is there? My father told me. He figured it out by watching the same thing you just noticed. Helen looked at the dark patch of pasture. And that is where you dug the well? Yes. So you dug where your father told you the water was? Yes. And your father figured it out by watching the grass? Yes. She nodded slowly, filing this information the way children file things they intend to access again. Then she said, Do you have to go to college to learn that? Clarence looked down at her. You have to learn to pay attention, he said. College is one place to do that. The pasture is another. She was quiet. Then, I want to learn both. That is the right answer, Clarence said. Norma Duvall died in the spring of 1991, a Tuesday in April, which had always been her favorite month. She had been sick for 6 months and had handled it with the same directness she brought to everything, going to her medical appointments alone and reporting results to Clarence in the same voice she used for weather forecasts, noting the relevant facts and moving on to what needed to be done next. She died in the farmhouse, in the bedroom they had shared for 43 years, with Clarence in the chair beside her and Raymond and Carol in the hallway. Helen was driving fast from Iowa City and did not make it in time, which was a thing she did not speak of easily for a long time afterward. Clarence sat in the front pew at the Lutheran church in Eldora and listened to the minister say things that were true about Norma, that she was patient, that she was honest, that she had a quality of attention that was rarer than people understood. He thought about the dish towel folded over the oven handle. He thought about the mason jar left on the fence post. He thought about 43 years of mornings in the kitchen where the coffee was made before he was downstairs and she had never once complained about any decision he had made that other people found ridiculous, not because she always agreed but because she understood the difference between having an opinion about a decision and it being your decision to make. He went back to the farm the day after the funeral and was in the machine shed by 7, which was what he did when he did not know what else to do. He worked until noon and then made his own lunch for the first time in 43 years. He found it more difficult than he had expected. Not the cooking. The other part. Helen stayed for 2 weeks and made sure he was eating and doing what needed doing. Then she went back to her job with the County Conservation Board in Iowa City, where she had worked since finishing her graduate degree in environmental hydrology. She called every Sunday. Raymond called every Wednesday. Clarence answered both calls from the chair in the living room with the phone cord stretched from the kitchen, sitting in the particular silence of a house that has had a person in it for a long time and now does not. In the fall of 1995, Garrett Soleil came to the farm. He had retired from the Extension Service and was writing a history of agricultural practice in central Iowa for the County Historical Society. He had, going through records of Farm Bureau meetings from the 1960s and 1970s, come across transcripts that included the relic comment. I want to be direct with you, he said over the phone. I said something at the 1971 Farm Bureau meeting that was disrespectful and inaccurate. I would like to come and tell you that in person. You are welcome to come, Clarence said. Soleil arrived on a Saturday in a modest sedan, wearing a windbreaker and carrying a notebook. He stood in the driveway and shook Clarence's hand and said, I called you a relic of a pre-scientific approach to agriculture. I would like to apologize for that. Clarence studied him. You were selling a product, he said. You believed in it. That is not wrong. I believed in it more than the evidence warranted, Soleil said. That is a different thing. Yes, Clarence agreed. It is. They went inside and the coffee was made because Clarence had made it, and they sat at the kitchen table and Soleil asked his questions for the history and Clarence answered them. At the end Soleil asked if he could come back and go through the whole story of the farm from the beginning. He came back 4 times that winter. The resulting account became a chapter in the county agricultural history published in 1997, titled The Duvall Farm, Continuous Operation on Traditional Principles, 1914 to 1996. It covered Edmund's purchase of the original 40 acres, Clarence's well, the droughts of 1983 and 1988, the stuck grader, Raymond and Helen, and the composition notebook of hydrological observations. Soleil read the final version to Clarence before publication. When he finished, Clarence said, "You left out the part about Boyd calling it a hole." Soleil looked up. "I thought you might prefer that left out." "Put it back in," Clarence said. "History is not useful if it only records the dignified parts." Soleil put it back in. He also asked Clarence, during one of those winter sessions, about the Farm Bureau exclusions, the Modernization Committee, the irrigation program threshold, the Leonard Pruitt letter, and the Franklin Cress comment to Art Belden that Clarence had heard about secondhand. Clarence had kept the Pruitt letter in a folder in the desk drawer for 33 years. He took it out and gave it to Soleil. Soleil read it and was quiet for a while. "This is a policy document," he said. "From the County Farm Bureau. Explicitly excluding you from a program because your methods did not align with the program's preferred technology." "Yes," Clarence said. "Did you ever challenge it formally?" "I asked Pruitt directly. He said it was a reasonable operational requirement." "In the Cress comment at the bank." "I heard about it from Art Belden. I have no document for that one." Soleil wrote in his notebook for a while. Then he said, "You were operating the most financially sound farm in this section of the county for most of the 1960s and 1970s. No debt. Continuous operation. And you were being excluded from county programs and publicly characterized as backward." "Yes," Clarence said. "How did you manage that?" Clarence looked out the window at the machine shed for a moment. "Edmund had a line in the journal," he said. "The land does not care whether they believe me. The land only cares whether I am right." He paused. "I was not always right. But I was right about the things that mattered most, and over enough time that showed." All of it went into the chapter. The exclusions, the Pruitt letter, the Cress comment, the Soleil remark at the Farm Bureau meeting in 1971. It was not comfortable reading for anyone who had been part of those decisions, but Clarence had said to put it in, and Soleil put it in, and the County Historical Society published it. Clarence Duvall died in November of 1998, 3 weeks after his 83rd birthday, on a Tuesday evening after supper, in the chair by the window in the living room. Raymond had been there for the weekend and gone back to Des Moines on Sunday. Helen had called Sunday evening and they had talked for 40 minutes about the acreage plan for the following spring and about a paper she was writing on nitrate contamination in shallow aquifers and glaciated terrain, a paper that cited both Edmund's journal and her own field data from the Hardin County farm. He was found the next morning by the neighbor who had been checking daily, sitting in the chair with his boots on, looking out at the machine shed, which was the last thing he had been looking at and was, as it happened, a reasonable thing to spend your last evening looking at. Helen came back to the farm the week after the funeral. Not for the estate, Raymond was handling that, but because she wanted to be there, in the place itself, among the things that had accumulated over 83 years of a specific kind of life. She found Edmund's journal in its oilcloth on the shelf above the workbench. She found the composition notebook Clarence had made in the winter of 1962, the systematic transcription of Edmund's hydrological observations organized by field and season. She found the Pruitt letter in the folder in the desk drawer. She found the copy of the 1997 county history. She sat at the kitchen table with the composition notebook and read through it slowly, the way you read things that have become more important than they were when you first read them. Then she called David Mead at Iowa State. She called her former advisor, Professor Lawrence Cobb, a hydrologist at the University of Iowa. She called Dr. Audrey Marsh, whom she had met at an environmental science conference and who was working on a project about traditional ecological knowledge and its integration with modern science. They came in the spring of 1999, all 3 of them, and spent 2 days at the farm going through the journals and walking the fields and looking at the well. Audrey Marsh lowered a bucket and pulled it up full of water that was cold and clear. "How long has this well been in use?" she asked. "My grandfather dug it in April of 1961, Helen said. 38 years ago." Marsh lowered the bucket again, just to see the water come up a second time. "No power source. Gravity fed? Rope and bucket for the first 10 years. He put in a hand pump in 1971. And the water table level?" Helen had the records. "The level fluctuates seasonally by about 2 feet. Late summer low, spring high. Average depth to water in summer is 40 feet. In spring it is 38. Marsh looked at Lawrence Cobb. Cobb looked at the well. That is consistent with a seasonally recharged perch system above an impermeable layer. Stable over decadal timescales if the recharge zone is maintained. The recharge zone is the North 40, Helen said. My grandfather kept it as permanent pasture his whole life. He said his father told him it was the filter. David Mead was writing in his notebook. He stopped and looked up. Did your grandfather use that word? Filter? No, Helen said. He called it the sponge. The paper that came from that visit was published in Environmental Science and Technology in 2001, co-authored by Cobb, Marsh, Mead, and Helen Duvall. Its title was Long-Term Stability of a Perched Aquifer System in Glaciated Iowa Terrain, Observational Records from 3 Generations of Small-Scale Farming Practice. It was cited 14 times in its first 3 years. It appeared on reading lists at 3 universities. Helen framed a copy and put it on the shelf in the machine shed, next to the 1997 county history and the composition notebook in Edmund's original journal. She also, that winter, went back through the Pruitt letter and Soleil's chapter and every exclusion she could document and wrote a separate account, not for publication, for the record, a clear chronological narrative of the systematic barriers her grandfather had faced from the County Farm Bureau, the state extension programming, and the local banking institution, barriers applied not because his farm was failing but because his methods did not conform to what those institutions were promoting. She called it what it was, which was discrimination based on method, the use of institutional authority to disadvantage a farmer whose approach the institutions had decided did not belong in their preferred future. She sent a copy to the Iowa Farm Bureau with the letter. She did not expect a response and did not receive one. She sent a copy to the Agricultural Engineering Department at Iowa State and received a note from David Mead saying he had shared it with his graduate seminar. She sent a copy to the County Historical Society and they added it to the archive alongside Soleil's chapter. She had not done it for Vindication. Clarence had not needed Vindication. The farm had provided it, in the specific arithmetic of scale tickets and paid tax bills and acres that were still in the family and a well that still had water. She had done it because the record was incomplete without it, because the history of what her grandfather had built was also a history of what had been put in his way, and a story with only the triumph and none of the resistance was not an accurate account of what the triumph had cost. Raymond took over management of the farm from the estate and leased the cropland to a neighbor while Helen continued at the Conservation Board. In 2003, when Raymond's health limited even the administrative work, Helen came back to Hardin County permanently. She bought Raymond's interest, reduced the leased acreage, and began farming a portion of it herself, using practices informed by the same principles as her grandfather's but not identical to them. She used the hand pump on the well for the kitchen garden and for spot irrigation on the market beds nearest the farmhouse. She drove the farm all-H, which she had put back into working condition with a machinist from Ames and which started on the 2nd or 3rd pull of the starter rope in most weather and the 5th or 6th below 20 degrees. She kept the North 40 as permanent pasture, understanding what that pasture was doing, what it had always been doing, what Edmund called the sponge in the 2001 paper called the recharge zone and what it was under any name, which was the reason the well had water in it. She also built a soil monitoring network across the farm using sensors sourced with a grant from the Iowa Department of Natural Resources. She maintained a digital database of soil moisture readings that she compared season by season with the entries in the composition notebook in Edmund's original journal. The comparison was not a formality. She was asking, with each data point, whether the land was behaving the way 3 generations of observation said it should behave, and when the answer was no, she was asking that harder question with more urgency. Over 10 years of comparison she found that the predictions embedded in Edmund's and Clarence's records were accurate in most respects, and wrong in ways that were themselves informative, wrong in correspondence with measurable changes in precipitation patterns and temperature averages that had occurred in the decades since the original observations were made, changes consistent with the climate data being assembled by scientists working at scales far larger than one farm in Hardin County. The second paper, published in Climatic Change in 2014, analyzed the correspondence between long-term farm observational records and regional climate trend data as a method for detecting climate signal in traditional ecological knowledge. It was cited more than the 2001 paper. She did not think her grandfather would have been surprised by any of it. He had always said that paying attention to a piece of ground for a long time was the most reliable way to learn what the ground was actually doing. Whether the subject was the location of a perched water table or the direction in which rainfall patterns were shifting, the method was the same. The patience was the same. The commitment to recording what you actually observed instead of what you predicted was the same. She thought about this one morning in April of 2019, a Tuesday, standing at the edge of the well in the low corner of the south pasture where the crabgrass was greening up 3 weeks earlier than the surrounding ground. She was 53, younger than Clarence had been when he dug the well and 3 years older than Edmund had been when he first described the limestone shelf in the journal. She lowered a measurement tape into the well and read the depth to water, 39 feet, 4 inches. April, good spring rain, consistent with the records going back to 1961. She clicked her pen and wrote the number on the clipboard. On the clipboard were 58 years of April readings, annotated with precipitation data, temperature records, and notes about observable changes in the pasture vegetation corresponding to each year. The column of numbers started with Edmund's winter entries and ran through Clarence's composition notebook and into her digital database, a column of April water levels describing in the specific language of a single hole in Hardin County, Iowa, what had happened to the water over 6 decades, what the land had been doing while people above it made decisions about it. She put the composite cover back on the well and stood there for a moment in the April morning, the light still low and the air still cool and the meadowlarks starting from the direction of the North 40. She thought about Clarence standing in the same spot in April of 1961 with his shirt off, feeling the not yet warm sun. She thought about Edmund writing in the winter of 1923 about the limestone shelf he had identified by watching the grass. She thought about the papers and the citations and the students in David Mead's class leaning forward when they understood something. She thought about what Clarence had said when she was 7 and had asked him if you had to go to college to learn what he knew. She had gone to college. She had gone to graduate school. And the most important thing she knew, the things other people found useful enough to cite and teach, had started with a man watching a corner of a pasture for 30 years before he decided to dig. That was not a reason not to go to college. The college gave her the language to explain what Edmund and Clarence had observed, and the language mattered. It allowed other people to test those observations against other data and other landscapes and understand whether what was true in Hardin County was true more broadly. The science was a tool for amplification, for taking what one man learned from watching one pasture and understanding what it said about the way water moved through glaciated terrain in general. But the thing being amplified had to be real first. It had to come from somewhere specific, from someone paying close attention to something actual over enough time to distinguish pattern from noise. That was what Edmund had done and what Clarence had continued and what the institutions of Hardin County had tried, through the ordinary mechanisms of exclusion and condescension and bureaucratic threshold setting, to make irrelevant, and what had turned out to be not irrelevant at all but foundational to knowledge that those same institutions now assigned in their graduate courses. She walked back toward the farmhouse across the April ground. The farmall H was in the machine shed. She would need it in 2 weeks for the cover crop work on the South 20. She had checked it in March, changed the oil, replaced a worn ignition point, run it for 20 minutes in the cold. It had started on the 4th pull. She went inside and made a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the clipboard in her laptop and began entering the morning's data into the database. Outside the window the light was strengthening on the pasture, the crabgrass coming in green in the low corner, the same corner it had always come in green. Edmund had noticed it first. Clarence had dug into it. She had published it in 2 papers and a digital database that was updated every April. The land had been saying the same thing for longer than any of them had been alive to hear it. The work, across 3 generations, had been learning to listen well enough to write it down in a language that others could use. That was not a small thing. It was not a relic. It was how knowledge actually moved through time, from the man watching the grass to the woman reading the dataset, carried on nothing more complicated and nothing less demanding than paying attention and writing it down and handing it to whoever came next.